Okay. Revelation chapter 19. We're going to start at 20. That's where we ended, but I want to back up a little bit and fill you in with where we were. Revelation chapter 19, verses 11 to 21, highlight Christ's role in the meting out of God's wrath that has occupied much of the book of Revelation. Jesus returns and he treads the winepress of the fury of God's wrath against those who had made war on him. So we have a vision of a returning Christ in chapter 19, verses 11 to 16, and his role in Armageddon, the outpouring of God's wrath. Christ's role in that is symbolized in 19:17 to 21. Then at chapter 20, we once again back up. Okay, this time to magnify or shine the spotlight on God's dealing with Satan prior to that final battle. And as I said last week, the point is that Satan will in no way set the end time agenda. God's sovereignty and his control over Satan is exhibited in the fact that he alone, God alone, is orchestrating salvation history. So let's pick up at chapter 20, verses 1 to 3. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit, and shut it and sealed it over him, so that he might not deceive the nations yet, until the 1,000 years were ended. After that, he must be released for a little while. So John, he sees an angel descends from heaven. He's holding a key to the abyss of the bottomless pit, and he has a great chain. And the angel, he binds Satan for 1,000 years, throws him into the pit, and shuts and seals it over him. Now, to understand what's being symbolized here, I think it's very important to focus on the second part of verse 3. It's crucial because that part of that verse specifies the reason why this is done. You see, the purpose of this binding is to deprive Satan of his power to deceive the nations for a period of time that was set by God. So to deprive him of that power to deceive the nations for that period of time, God has determined. In God's time, the time set by him, Satan will be released from the restriction God has placed on him. And when that happens, he then deceives the nations to gather them together for the great battle against God, as it says in verses 7 and 8 of chapter 20. Let me quote to you a New Testament scholar, a Bible teacher, a guy named Sam Storms. And this is a 5-slide quote, but if I didn't think it was worth it, I wouldn't give it to you. But I like the way he expresses what's going on here. He says, the question must be asked, in regard to what is Satan bound? Is the binding of Satan designed to immobilize him from any and all activities? The premillennialists think so. I'm not a premillennialist. I'm an amillennialist. Okay, but he says the premillennialist thinks so. Beasley Murray tells us that Satan's binding entails his inability, quote, to harm the race of man, end quote. But is this what John says? Clearly not. The premillennialist interpretation errs in that it has attempted to universalize what John explicitly restricts. 2 statements in Revelation 20 tell us the purpose of Satan's imprisonment. First, in verse 3, John says that Satan was bound so that he should not deceive the nations any longer. Then I have a little note there. That's me saying it's better to say to not deceive the nations yet. In other words, to take that word as yet instead of any longer, and I'll say more about that in a second. But in any event, don't miss the point. First, in verse 3, John says that Satan was bound so that he should not deceive the nations any longer. Then secondly, in verse 8, John tells us that upon his release from the abyss, Satan will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. Note well what John does and does not say. He does not say that Satan was bound so that he should no longer persecute Christians, or so that he should no longer prowl about like a roaring lion, devouring believing men and women. He does not say that Satan was bound so that he should no longer concoct schemes to disrupt church unity, or so that he should no longer disguise himself as an angel of light. He does not say that Satan was bound so that he should no longer hurl his flaming missiles at Christians, or so that he should be kept from thwarting the plans of the Apostle Paul. Rather, John says that Satan was bound so that he should no longer deceive the nations, the purpose behind which is to mobilize them in an international rebellion against the city of God. And the language John employs in 21-3 makes it clear that there is no possible way for Satan to do so during the 1,000 years. The restriction on this particular aspect of his sinister ministry is absolute and invincible. The intent of the devil is to incite a premature, eschatological end-time conflict to provoke Armageddon before its, that is to say, before God's time. But the exalted Christ, through the agency of an angelic being, has temporarily stripped Satan of his ability to orchestrate the nations of the earth for the final battle, regardless of the form that battle might assume. The final offensive against the Lamb and his elect shall come only when the restriction placed on this element of Satan's work is lifted. For the duration of the present Christian era, Satan's hand is stayed. Upon release from his imprisonment, he will dispatch his demonic hordes, which go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them together for the war on the great day of God the Almighty, Revelation 16:14. Although Satan may and will do much in this present age, as the epistles clearly indicate, there's one thing of which John assures us: Satan will never be permitted to incite and organize the unbelieving nations of the world in a final, catastrophic assault against the church until such time as God in his providence so determines. That event, which the Lord will immediately terminate with the fiery breath of his mouth, will come only at the end of this age. Now, I think that is what's happening. I think that's what's being said. Another New Testament scholar, commentator, Dennis Johnson, not to be confused with Alan Johnson, who's also written a commentary on Revelation. Dennis Johnson similarly says, although it's true throughout history that Satan, the ancient serpent, deceives the world, in this vision, a specific deception to obtain a specific objective is in view. We see this objective when at the end of the 1,000 years, the dragon is released and comes out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. The war, as we've seen, is a reference to the war of the great day of God the Almighty, for which the world's kings were gathered by three unclean spirits that proceed from the mouths of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. Their role is to deceive the kings in order to gather them, as is shown by the demon's origin in the mouths of the arch-villains and the signs they perform, as the false prophet deceives those who dwell on the earth through his signs. In light of this explanation of the aim behind the dragon's deception, his binding during the 1,000 years prevents Satan from gathering the nations in a worldwide conspiracy to blot out the church. Now, as we have seen throughout Revelation, you see it in chapter 13, verses 13 and 14, chapter 16, verse 14, chapter 18, verse 23. We'll see it in saw it in chapter 19, verse 20. And as is indicated elsewhere, in the New Testament in Matthew 24:24, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, it is largely through the exercise of miraculous power that Satan will deceive the nations into gathering against God. And since the purpose of this binding is to prevent him from so deceiving the nations, I submit to you that this binding, what it symbolizes, is the removal of Satan's power to perform nation-gathering miracles. The kind of jaw-dropping miracles that seem to unbelievers to confirm his identity. Because those miracles are going to play a key role in the gathering of the nations in the war against God and his Christ. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that since what is being done is we are restricting his ability to be able to gather the nations for that war, and since a significant part of his gathering the nations for that war is the performance of nation-gathering miracles, is that what this binding symbolizes is a restriction on that power. Okay? That's what I think is being done. As Gregory Beale says, so we've seen that throughout. Beale says regarding, now remember I mentioned that yet, because many translations will say to keep him from deceiving the nations any longer. And I had the little note there. I said, no, I think it's to keep him from deceiving the nations yet, you see, until he's released to do that. Well, as Gregory Beale points out, and many others would acknowledge this, it's possible that Eddie could be rendered yet. So you could render it any longer, as many translations do, but you can also render it yet with the resultant translation, he should not yet deceive the nations. Right? If that's the right way to render it, and I think it is, if that's the right way, well then there's no idea of a former ongoing deception that is brought to an end. In other words, it's not like he was doing these things and then it stopped. It's like the power to do them is taken from him before he's able to launch it. Right? See, so the point is not that he was exercising nation-gathering miracles previously, but that he's stripped of his power to do so in the future until God's appointed time. Until the 1,000 years are over and he's turned loose, that power is returned to him, and then he immediately goes out, gathers the nations, and then Christ returns. And I think this understanding is reflected in the New English translation. You can see it in the New, well, I should have hit that slide earlier. But in the New English translation, where it says, the angel then threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it so that he could not deceive the nations until the 1,000 years were finished. Okay, so that's the same idea what I'm telling you about yet. He very simply threw him in there. He couldn't deceive them until the 1,000 years were finished. Until that power that had been taken from him, till the chains were cut loose, so that he's now able to perform these miracles and then to gather the nations for this final battle against God. Now the power will be restored. He will be set free in that restriction only when God chooses to consummate, to finalize the kingdom, to bring this overlap of ages to a close, right? The kingdom has been inaugurated. It's a present reality, but it is not at this point the final reality. It overlaps with this fallen age or fallen order until Jesus returns. Okay, so that's the timing that he's talking about. When in God's time to consummate this kingdom for the return of Christ, that's when this will occur. And this may well be what Paul's referring to in 2 Thessalonians in chapter 2, verses 6 through 8, where in a discussion about Antichrist, the man of lawlessness, he says, and you know what is now restraining him so that he will be revealed in his own time. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, only there is now one restraining it until he's out of the way, and then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to nothing with the appearance of his coming. And the idea seems to be that the mystery of lawlessness, the spirit of Antichrist, is already at work in the world when Paul is writing that, right? John says it in 1 John. Even now, many antichrists. You see, the spirit of Antichrist is loose. So it seems to be this mystery of lawlessness is already at work in the world, but it is not yet culminated in the appearance of the figure Antichrist, because one of God's angels is restraining that appearance in some way so that Antichrist will only appear in God's time. And that fits with an angel-administered restraint on Satan's power to perform the kind of miracles necessary for Antichrist to fulfill the role of gathering and organizing the world in rebellion against God. So I see a parallel here. I think that's what's being suggested here, right? It is an angel administered. So there in the vision, the angel's chaining him. And so I think it's the same thing going on here. Now, the time of 1,000 years, the time that symbolizes the fullness of God's time, right? That's 10 cubed. And I've talked about 10 being a number of completion from 10 fingers, probably. But you have it now. So you have 10 times 10 times 10. So it's this idea of God, the fullness of God's time. And I think the point is that Satan is in no way going to jump the gun and thereby dictate the timing of the end. He will not be released. He is subject to God. He will not be released until the precise moment God desires. God's running the show. See, Satan is not. And Satan is released from the restriction on his power to perform nature-gathering miracles. He's released from that for a little while. And he's released from that for a little while because he will promptly, through Antichrist and the false prophet, gather the nations for opposition to God and his saints, and then he's done away with promptly at Christ's return, as we'll see in verses 7 through 10. Okay, so he's released for a little while, so he's barred, he's restricted from being able to prematurely incite the end. And God will turn him loose. He will then go out and through this now power of nation-gathering miracles, he will promptly gather the nations for the war. You say, well, why would he do that? Because he thinks he's the Duke. You say, oh, what's wrong with him? Well, there's something wrong with him, clearly, right? But he's like pride exemplified. He's a paragon of pride. And so he thinks, so he's going to go out and he's going to start this assault. And then Jesus will return. And he will do what we saw in chapter 19 and elsewhere. He's going to finish the job. Now that this is a stepping back to present Armageddon from a different angle, rather than a chronological continuation from chapter 19, it's supported, I think, strongly by the fact Revelation chapter 19, verses 11 to 21, portrays the complete destruction of all of God's enemies at the return of Christ. Right? All men, free and slave, small and great, they're all taken. Right? The kings of the earth and their armies, they're gathered against the Lord and are crushed. You see that in chapter 19. As R. Fowler White comments, he says, it makes no sense to speak of protecting the nations from deception by Satan in chapter 20, verses 1 to 3, after they've just been both deceived by Satan and destroyed by Christ at his return in 19:11 to 21. You see, so that's what I'm saying. I say it supports this notion, you see, that this is a stepping back, as we've seen throughout Revelation. It's apocalyptic literature. It's dreamlike, and it moves that way. So we have 19, we have this final assault, we have the destruction of the enemies of God, and then we drop back and we look at God's dealing with Satan prior to that, where he has chained him and restricted it so that he controls the timing of the end. So I think that's what's going on there. Now, verses 4 to 6, I'm going to give you my translation of that. Now, whenever anybody says that, it's not radically different. And I'll point out the places where I think they're, more debatable, so you can focus on those in your skepticism and say, okay, and I think that's healthy. When somebody's teaching you says something, that's a warning to you. So, be on the alert, pay special attention to what I'm saying, listen to what I'm saying, weigh it, and see if you think there's merit to it. Okay? So here's 20 verses 4 to 6. And I give you it this way because it simply will make it easier for you to follow my understanding. If I put something else up there, I then have to keep going back and saying, well, I don't think that, and I think this. I'm going to give it to you the way I think it, and I'll explain about it as I go through it, okay? So here's chapter 20, verses 4 to 6. And I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. That is, the souls of the ones who were beheaded because of the testimony of Jesus and because of the word, the kind who did not worship the beast nor its image and did not receive the mark on their forehead and on their hand. And they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not live until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one having part in the first resurrection. Over these, the second death does not have power. Rather, they will be priests of God and of Christ and will reign with him the 1,000 years. Okay, the first part of chapter 20, verse 4. It says, and I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. Nothing really controversial there. That's maybe more wooden than your translation, but that's what's being said. Then it says here, then the next word in the Greek text is a very common conjunction. It's the word kai. Okay, and it's frequently translated, commonly rendered and, or also. Okay, so many translations take it that way. And so they take it that way, and they indicate that John sees two distinct things. That John first sees thrones on which are seated certain unidentified beings. Those referred to simply as they and them, right? And they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. So if you take the conjunction that way, you say, well, he's seeing two things. He's seeing these sitting on thrones, these unidentified beings, referred to as they and them, and he's also seeing the souls of martyrs. Okay, so that's one way of looking at it. But that Greek conjunction, kai, is often used in what is known as exegetically. That's a mouthful. Okay, it's used that way, which means that it's used to mark that the following clause is an explanation of what has preceded. Okay, and when you understand it that way, typically the way you note that or indicate that in English is you say, that is, right? So that's how I've rendered it. And that's not odd, okay? Many people recognize that is an exegetical use of kai there. So it says, sat on the thrones and judgment was given to them. Well, who are the they and the them? Under my view, it's not two different groups. It's this group who's further identified. Those who are seated on the thrones are the souls of the ones who were beheaded because of the testimony of Jesus and because of the Word of God. You see, so it's that is. In other words, elaborating, identifying further who is seated on the throne that way. So they're the ones to whom these martyrs, the souls of these martyrs, they're the ones to whom or for whom, and I'll say something about that in a bit, judgment is given. So the statement that they were beheaded for their faith, right? Are you saying then when he says they're beheaded for their faith, is he limiting the martyrs to those who only happen to be killed that particular way? I don't think so. You see, I think they were beheaded. It's simply a way of being martyred. I think it represents all those who are martyred. It's not meant to exclude those who had been put to death for their faith by other means, but rather it symbolizes all who were martyred. Okay, so I think what you're seeing here is thrones, and on those thrones are the souls of Christian martyrs. Now, this is a different perspective and presentation, right? We've seen the souls of martyrs before. We saw the souls of martyrs in chapter 6, verse 9. And I think this is a different presentation, a different perspective and presentation of the souls of those martyrs who in chapter 6, verse 9 are under the altar and are crying out, how long? How long until we are vindicated? How long until the judgment? Well, this is the same group. These are martyrs, and they're just presented from a different perspective. Brian Blount, in his commentary, he says, John's language is metaphorical rather than literal. His clear paralleling of this text with chapter 6, verse 9, indicates that he thinks of these executed souls as the same group. I think that's right. I think it's just showing them from a different angle. Beheaded in chapter 20, verse 4, is John's way of amplifying the term executed in 6:9. Okay, there it wasn't specific to being beheaded. That's what I'm saying. When he says beheaded, he's simply talking about the martyrs, those who've given their lives for their faith. And so it's not restricted to them. And it is speaking of this same group here in chapter 6, verse 9. Similarly, Dennis Johnson, in his commentary, says, these souls had earlier appeared as sacrificial blood poured out under the altar, Revelation 6:9. Now they appear as risen and ruling overcomers. For indeed they overcame the dragon because of the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, which they maintained even unto death. Okay, so who's on the throne? To me, it's the souls of the martyrs, which is just a different angle or perspective or presentation of those souls of the martyrs that were in chapter 6, verse 9. Now, many translators and commentators recognize the Kai is used again after this phrase, the Word of God, and many recognize that the Kai immediately after the Word of God, that is exegetical, that signals an explanatory clause following. So the clause provides information about the martyrs being discussed. Okay, so far nothing really odd about that or really controversial. But nearly all of them think, you see, that the following clause identifies those martyrs as those who did not worship the beast nor its image and did not receive the mark on their forehead and on their hand. Okay, in other words, they think the souls of the martyrs on the thrones are the souls of those who were martyred during the final generation when Antichrist was on the scene. Okay, I don't think those martyrs are from the final generation. I don't think they're from the final generation. Rather, they're from prior generations, but were the kind who, in the final generation, refused to worship the beast. Okay, so the question, the debatable thing is this a legit rendering of this relative pronoun hoitenis? That's a form of the pronoun hostis. Okay, and so is that legit to render that instead of identifying them as those who were martyred in the final generation, as simply saying they are like those, they are the kind who were martyred in the final generation. In other words, distinguishing them, but saying that these are the same, they're like of this class, of this kind. All right? So the question is that legit? And that relative pronoun, it certainly can mean the way it's commonly taken by people. It can mean who, which, and identify them. Okay? If it wasn't possible, they wouldn't all think that. So that's certainly right, that it can mean that. And so it can serve to identify the martyrs as those who resisted Antichrist, and that's what most people believe. But that pronoun, it can also have what's known as a qualitative sense, in which case it indicates that persons belong to a certain class. Okay, the famous, from a prior generation, famous New Testament scholar, C.F.D. Moule, says of hostis that it can mean something like, quote, who is such that? Okay? So who is such that? Now, the Greek grammarian from another generation, A.T. Robertson, he observes, he says, the value of the pronoun hostis, that's the pronoun we're talking about, okay? It's just the form of it in this particular place is hoitenis, but the pronoun, relative pronoun is hostis. And he says here, sometimes does not differ greatly from another pronoun, hoios. Okay, hostis and hoios. So here's this noted Greek grammarian who is saying, well, there are certain uses where hostis overlaps, it bangs into the usage of this other pronoun, hoios. Okay? And according to the standard, I know this, there's no way for me to do this without getting some technical, okay? So I know how this sounds and all that, but if I don't say this, you're just going to walk away and say, the guy just asserted this nonsense. So I'm trying to explain it to you. I don't do it that way. I don't just come and just make stuff up. Okay? I think through these things, and then I can give you the rationale, and you can then go, okay, I see what he's saying. If you can leave here and say, I see why he thinks that, then I'm happy. Okay? I hope when you see why I think that, did you say, and I think he's right? I'd like that. But if you say, at least you come out and say, I see why he thinks that, then I feel like I've communicated successfully. Okay, so I have to do that, but that's what I'm doing. So you have, Robertson says, look, this word hostis bumps up against the meaning of this other pronoun hoios, and that pronoun hoios in the standard Greek lexicon is defined, it says, pertaining to being similar to something or belonging to a class of what sort. And to give you a really good idea of how that other pronoun is used, hoios, here is a statement from a Greek historian, Plutarch, who writes right around the time. He's late 1st, early 2nd century. John's writing in the mid-90s. So this guy's right at the time. And here's his use of hoios. He says, this high honor should belong not to those who were descended from Heracles, but to men like Heracles. And like Heracles is hoios Heracles. Okay, hoios. You see him hiding in there in yellow? Like Heracles. Similar to Heracles. But there's not an identity going on there, and I think that's important. Now, this qualitative sense of hostis that I'm suggesting to you works here. This qualitative sense, you can see it in other places, and I'll spare you these in 1 Corinthians 5:1, 1 Timothy 6:9, 1 Timothy 2:2, Titus 1:11. I have written down here that I'm not going to read to you, commentators who use hostis in those particular verses consistently with how I'm using it here in Revelation. Okay? But you seem to be getting bored to me, so I'm going to skip that part. Okay? I hear that. All right. Now, what I think is being said is that these martyrs are the same kind or class. They have the same faith as those who suffered under Antichrist in John's earlier vision. Right? You see in chapter 11, 7, 13, 15, 17, 6, 18, 24. They're cut from the same cloth. That's what I think. They're cut from the same cloth. They exhibited in their time and place the same unshakable loyalty to Christ as Christians in John's vision who suffered under the beast. Right now, in historical chronology, the beast's great persecution of the saints, his war on the Lamb, it comes after the suffering of Christians during the time of Satan's restraint. Right? Are you following me? Right? The time of Satan's restraint is when he is prevented from doing nation-gathering miracles that he will then use to draw the nations together for the great war. So it is before the time of Antichrist when these people are, when they're enduring their persecution. But historically, in historical chronology, right, Antichrist comes after them. But in John's vision, it's already been revealed. See, that future has already been reported and revealed. So John, though historically, these martyrs during the time of Satan's chaining, Satan's restraint, before he's turned loose to gather the nations and Antichrist comes and we then have the end. See, it has already been reported what these people in that final generation were like. So John can report these people who are martyred before that time chronologically and still say that their faith is such as those who are going to be martyred in the final generation. Well, how can he say that? Because he's already reported in a vision their martyring in the final generation. Okay, so I think that works and that makes sense. They're the kind, you see, they're cut from the same cloth. They are the kind who did not worship the beast nor its image in their own generation and time. And I think that's what he's saying. Now that understanding, see, seeing it that way, that then accounts for the paralleling of the martyrs in 6-9. Because with Blount and Johnson, you see that this is just another way of referring to those martyrs in 6-9. As Blount said in the quote I gave you earlier, that paralleling indicates that John thinks of these executed souls as the same group. Okay, well, if that's right, well, since the martyrs in 6-9, they clearly predate the coming of Antichrist, right? They're calling out for the judgment. They're calling out for final vindication. So they clearly predate it, and these martyrs are presented as the same group. So I think it's best to recognize them as martyrs during the time of Satan's restriction, which is before the time of Antichrist, but they are the kind who, in their faithfulness unto death, they are the kind who, in the final generation, were faithful unto death in the face of Antichrist. I'm going at it every way I can to try to communicate this to you, okay? All right, I think that's it. Now, let's say that's wrong, and you say, no, I don't buy that. I don't think that hostis can carry that meaning here the way you're claiming it, and I think it identifies the people. In other words, you say that I think it's saying that these people who did not worship the beast, they are those martyrs who or which did not worship. In other words, he's identifying them, not saying they're a type who or they're like them. He's identifying them. Well, I think that even in that case, you could argue that John is simply for rhetorical purposes characterizing resistance to prior manifestations of the spirit of Antichrist as not worshiping the beast or receiving his mark. In this book, Revelation like this, apocalyptic literature, I don't think that would be out of bounds. So I don't think that completely closes the door, but I think the solution I'm giving you, I think it's more viable. Now I suggest to you that the souls of these martyrs who are on the thrones, those who were faithful unto death, as were those who resisted Antichrist in the final generation, that these souls, these martyrs, are exemplary conquerors who represent all the faithful brothers and sisters, even those who did not die or those who died from causes other than martyrdom, right? In chapter 3, verse 21. So you say, well, why would you think that? Okay, well, first, they're exemplary here as conquerors. But in chapter 3, verse 21, it's the conquerors and overcomers to whom Jesus grants the privilege of sitting with him on his throne, a group that is not restricted to martyrs. You see, that's the martyrs there aren't specified. It is there. It is those who are conquerors and overcomers. It includes all who remain faithful, who resist all that threatens to alienate them from Jesus. Right? As you and I live our lives and do that, we resist all that threatens to alienate us from Him. But martyrs are the quintessential overcomers. That's why I think they are suitable representation of all the faithful, because all the overcomers, all of the conquerors will be here. But the martyrs are quintessential overcomers, so they are a suitable representation of all the faithful. Let me read to you what Alan Johnson says in his commentary. He says, I feel somewhat more comfortable with the view expressed earlier that the martyrs represent the whole church that is faithful to Jesus, whether or not they have actually been killed. They constitute a group that can in truth be described as those who did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. 12:11. As such, the term is a synonym for overcomers. Okay, so what I think is being, I heard that bell, what I think is being seen is the blessed intermediate state, okay, of the Christians who have died, represented by them sitting on these thrones in that intermediate state. This is before the final generation. This is before the unchaining. This is those who have died in faith during the time of Satan's restraint. Okay? I'll pick back up here and try to bring us back up to speed next week, Lord willing. Thanks for hanging.